Slide 1. Ocean pollution, Topic 13b, Part 2, Examples of pollutions. In this unit, we will examine specific examples of ocean pollutants. Slide 2. DDT. DDT is a pesticide that was commonly in use in the United States until the 1970s, by which time its dangers had been realized. Pesticides are chemicals used to kill insects and other organisms that eat or damage food crops and other crops. Thus, pesticides help farmers grow more food, since less food is ruined by pests. Like all pesticides, DDT was washed off crops, down rivers, and into the oceans where it bioaccumulated, was passed up the food chain. See Unit 13b-1 for a more detailed description of how bioaccumulation works. For example, the population of brown pelicans in Southern California dropped rapidly when high DDT concentrations in their food caused their eggs to break. Mother birds were sitting on and crushing their babies. DDT is a calcium inhibitor. It weakens the calcium carbonate in the egg shells. Bald eagles are another example. By the 1960s, DDT had reduced the nesting bald eagle population to 417 birds. They were finally taken off the endangered species list in 2007. In Southern California, the Montrose plant in Torrance, and others, dumped their wastes into the local sewer system from the 1940s until the 1970s. Sewage pipes dumped DDT and other chemicals into the ocean south of Palos Verdes, and lots of them are still present in the local sediments. As a result, we have a large ocean Superfund site in the United States, right here along our coastline. Superfund is the nickname for the law, CERCLA, 1980, that allows the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, to identify and assess places with chemicals that are dangerous to human health and the local environment. The EPA has ranked how dangerous each place is, and prioritizes getting the most dangerous places cleaned up first. According to the Superfund law, the EPA can force polluters to clean up their mess, but in some cases, like south of Palos Verdes, there is so much pollution that the original polluters cannot afford to clean it up. If the government tried to make the polluting company do so, then the polluters would immediately go out of business, and the pollution would not get cleaned up. Thus, the government, that is, our tax dollars, must clean up most of the mess. Polluters have to contribute a reasonable amount, if they are still in business. Government agencies and environmental groups try to warn fishermen and the public not to catch, sell, or eat certain kinds of fish, particularly those that eat worms and other animals that might have been living in the toxic mud south of Palos Verdes. They are also told to avoid eating fatty tissues, which are more likely to have the toxins in them. Recent measurements by the Environmental Protection Agency, 2009, suggest that DDT and PCB levels have dropped by 90% in the sediments since the last sampling 5 years before, much faster than the 1% to 2% per year that had been measured previously. However, levels in ocean life have not gone down much at all. Where the DDT has gone, and why it has left, is still unclear. Since only a few samples were taken, to keep down costs. Perhaps they just happened to take samples in spots with low concentrations. Controversially, DDT is still used in some places to kill malaria-causing mosquitoes. Some people think widespread malaria is worse for public health than pollution-related illnesses and environmental damage. Slide 3. PCBs. PCBs are a family of chemical compounds that are difficult to break down. This made them valuable in many products, particularly as insulators in electronics. Other products with PCBs included rubbers, paints, and oils. It makes oils less likely to burn. PCBs' durability makes them dangerous pollutants, because they break down into their harmless components very slowly. Unfortunately, PCBs' potential for harming people was not realized until decades after their widespread use and the unrestricted dumping of products containing them. Known health problems among humans include liver damage, and a painful and disfiguring skin disease. Perhaps the most interesting aspect of PCBs in the ocean is how widespread they are. Even though products were dumped primarily in developed countries like the United States, Japan, countries in Europe, and so on, PCBs are a problem for many animals who live near the poles. This shows how effective the ocean's currents and the atmosphere's winds are at spreading out pollutants. For example, bioaccumulation of PCBs has caused female polar bears to develop male genitals. Studies of people who live in the Arctic and eat pilot whales have shown that PCBs in their bodies appear to reduce the effectiveness of vaccines against illnesses like tetanus. Slide 4. Mercury. Like DDT and PCBs, mercury becomes dangerous in the ocean via bioaccumulation. Some bacteria use mercury in the environment in a form of chemosynthesis and in doing so convert the mercury into a toxic form called methylmercury. The bacteria are eaten by zooplankton, and the more bacteria that the zooplankton eat, the more toxic the zooplankton become. Small fish then eat the zooplankton, and the more zooplankton that the small fish eat, the more toxic the small fish become. The bacteria also can release the mercury into the water where it can be absorbed by phytoplankton and other organisms. Thus, consumption of phytoplankton by zooplankton can also be a pathway by which bioaccumulation can occur. However, unlike DDT and PCBs, mercury is not a man-made substance, so we do not harm the environment by making mercury. Mercury is a natural substance. We harm the environment by releasing mercury in unnaturally large quantities into the environment. Mercury is used in several industries, and often released into the atmosphere via smokestacks that are burning coal. The mercury is then washed out of the atmosphere when it rains, where it gets into soil, rivers, lakes, and the ocean. Mercury can cause neurological disorders. A few of the many possible effects include blindness, brain damage, and birth defects. Some people are unable to control their own bodies, they might shake uncontrollably or become paralyzed. An example of what the disorder might do to someone is the Mad Hatter from Alice in Wonderland, whose character is based on real-life hatters who tended to become a little crazy from mercury poisoning back in Victorian England. Hatters making felt hats worked too closely with mercury. We just didn't know any better back then. Coal is by far the worst fossil fuel to burn. In addition to adding a lot more mercury to the environment, burning coal releases more small particles that harm our lungs and more greenhouse gases that warm the planet than any other fossil fuel. Burning coal also causes smog and acid rain. In much of the world, coal is the cheapest fossil fuel. In developing and industrializing countries like China and India, burning coal leads to terrible air pollution in cities. Countries like China are trying to switch to other ways to generate electricity as quickly as they can afford to do so. Eating fish and other seafood. Some recommendations. Eating fish is an important part of a healthy diet. Most fish have omega-3 fatty acids, good for your heart, and are low in saturated fats, making them an excellent source of protein. However, to reduce the risk of mercury-related diseases in their children, damage to hearing, hand-eye coordination, learning ability, and more, pregnant women should probably avoid eating a lot of fish. Young children should have no more than 1/3 of a solidly packed can of tuna per week, and women who may become pregnant should not eat more than 1 solidly packed can of tuna per week. You want to keep the levels in your body down if are thinking about having children anytime in the near future, say within the next couple of years. About 10% of women of childbearing age have mercury levels above those considered safe by the EPA the last time I checked. Examples of seafood which typically have low levels of mercury include salmon, shrimp, clams, tilapia, crab, and scallops. You can eat up to 12 ounces a week of them. Note that fish sticks and fish sandwiches in places like McDonald's are made from low-mercury fish. Albacore light tuna typically contains more mercury than light tuna. The FDA recommends avoiding large, predatory fish like shark, swordfish, tilefish, and king mackerel. Big predators have more toxins, because they eat many of their prey and take in their prey's toxins when they eat their prey. Thus big predators have many times more toxins than their prey. In short, eating organisms lower on the food chain is safer. According to a Food and Drug Administration study, FDA, human flesh is unfit for consumption, because the concentration of pollutants is too high, which is bad news for cannibals. Like other top predators, we get a large dose of pollutants in the foods we eat. Slide 5. Plastics. Plastics have been called a man-made miracle substance. Just think of all the items around you that are made out of plastic: pens, pencils, computer keyboards, combs, binders, car dashboards, cups, straws, action figures, and much, much more. Plastics are great because they can easily be molded into a wide variety of forms and are strong, durable, lightweight, and cheap to manufacture. Thus, you can make nearly anything out of them, the object will last for a long time, it will be easy to carry, and everyone can afford to buy what you make. These advantages are precisely what make plastics a dangerous ocean pollutant. Some people consider plastic to be the worst ocean pollutant. Since plastic is lightweight, plastics have a low density and thus float at the surface of the ocean where most ocean life is found. Plastics are strong and durable, so they do not break down easily or become soft. Many animals like seals, sea turtles, and seagulls are strangled by or choke on plastics, presumably mistaking them for the animals that they normally eat. Their dead bodies contain stomachs full of plastic products, interfering with their ability to take in and digest their food. When alive, the animals may have felt full and forgotten to eat, or may have had difficulty finding food if their stomachs were hurting them. When their dead bodies decompose, the plastic is released back into the environment to kill again. Slide 6. Plastics do break down over time in the ocean and become small particles, especially when exposed to sunlight. The salty water, waves, and oxygen help too. We say that the plastic photodegrades into microplastics. However, plastics have a tendency to absorb toxic ocean pollutants like DDT and PCBs, so these tiny plastic particles may cause even more harm to ocean life through bioaccumulation than large plastic products do by choking animals. Tiny plastic particles are eaten by animals filter feeding plankton from the ocean. The more plastics that the animals mistakenly eat, the more toxins build up in their bodies, and in the bodies of predators who eat them. Plastic also build up and take up space in these animals' stomachs, so it interferes with their ability to take in and digest their food. Slide 7. Since plastic products are cheap to make, lots are made, lots are bought, and people don't worry about throwing them away, since it is cheap to buy more. Thus, a lot of plastics end up getting washed down storm drains when it rains and into the ocean, or blown off the land by winds. Since so much plastic is made and then thrown away, animals are more likely to encounter and eat plastic products than if less was made and discarded. Nowadays the largest source of plastic pollution from the land is Asia, because the population is large and many people's garbage is not picked up and taken to a landfill by a company or government agency. About 1 in 6 plastic water bottles are recycled. In the next 10 years, people will throw away enough plastic water bottles to cover the entire coast of California 6 inches deep and 20 feet wide. Almost every bit of plastic that we have made still exists. A very small amount has been incinerated. Most plastic litters the land or ends up in landfills, but a large amount has also congregated in the center of ocean gyres, pushed and held there by the prevailing surface winds and ocean currents. There are not huge islands made of plastic in the center of the gyres, but people who sail through these waters see plastic trash floating on the surface in every direction they look, and the concentration of plastic in the water is quite high. The amount of tiny plastic pellets in a net sample can be 6 times heavier than the amount of plankton. In the North Pacific Ocean, a high concentration of plastic debris covers an area twice the size of Texas. Most ocean pollution is found near the coasts, because most pollution is washed off the land by rainwater runoff, including plastics. That being said, plastics are becoming a major exception to the rule that most pollution is found near the coasts. People on land may be responsible for a lower percentage of the plastic in the ocean than we thought. It was thought that about 80% of the plastic in the North Pacific garbage patch came from people on land. A recent report, 2020, shows that over half of the mass, the big pieces, is actually from fishing, mostly nets but also ropes and various traps and containers. Some of these are lost by accident, and the rest are dumped by their owners. About 20% of the plastic in the North Pacific was dragged out to sea by the tsunami that hit Japan in 2011. Whether other studies will support these conclusions and whether the same is true of garbage patches in the other oceans remains to be seen. Probably the biggest mystery when it comes to plastic pollution in the ocean is that there should be more of it. Estimates vary, but everyone agrees we should be finding at least 90% more plastic in the ocean than we are. What has happened to it? Is some process destroying it? Maybe. Some percentage is inside animals that have consumed it. And some plastic is deeper in the ocean. Most surveys look for plastic at the surface, so we have good data from the surface. Several studies have found small plastic particles in water well below the surface, but no widespread surveys have been done yet. There is also no good data on the major paths by which plastic gets deeper into the ocean, but there are likely hypotheses. Plastic has a lower density than water, but it can get stuck to sinking sediments, often the bodies of plankton. Plastic can be in the wastes of larger animals that sink towards the bottom. And when animals die, their dead remains carry the plastic inside them towards the bottom. Small plastic particles are also found on land. They are making up a larger and larger part of our beach sediments. I guess this is one solution to the problem of beach erosion. Scientists are also finding microplastics in soil on land, where they are presumably being eaten by earthworms and other organisms in the soil. The plastic can then be passed up the food chains of land animals. Thus, microplastics may end up being a problem on land as well. Slide 8. Oil. When people are asked to think of an example of ocean pollution, often the first thing that they think of is an oil spill. Ironically, some scientists consider oil to be one of the least harmful ocean pollutants, because oil is a hydrocarbon. It is a fossil fuel, and thus was originally a carbohydrate in a living organism. Carbohydrates have one water molecule per carbon atom. The oxygen atoms are removed to make it into a hydrocarbon. You can see how the word hydrocarbon is the word carbohydrate reversed. In other words, oil is a natural substance that is biodegradable. For example, it is the source of energy for some chemosynthetic bacteria. Like mercury, oil is an example of a natural substance that humans introduce into the environment in unnaturally high concentrations. It is the unnaturally high concentration that can make it a pollutant. Humans have caused the amount of oil in the ocean to nearly double its natural level, mainly because of oil leaking from our cars and other machines that is washed into the ocean, not oil spills. The amount of oil washed off the land and into the ocean each year is equal to about 17 Exxon Valdez oil spills. The Exxon Valdez was a large tanker that caused a big oil spill near Alaska. Oil, natural gas, tar, and other petroleum products naturally leak from the bottom of the ocean in many places, including Southern California, and support chemosynthetic communities of organisms. See Unit 10b, Deep Sea Life, for more information about chemosynthetic communities. Most of the oil in the ocean, over 50%, has leaked naturally from the ocean bottom. Of course, oil spills do cause tremendous harm to ocean life. Lots of algae, animals, and plants quickly die after being coated with oil. Oil ruins the insulating feathers and fur of marine birds and mammals, so they become too cold and die. Some animals are poisoned by ingesting the oil. The toxic compounds mixed in with the oil often hit plankton the worst, killing both the plankton at base of the food chain and the eggs and larvae of large animals. An entire generation can be lost. However, most populations begin to rebound within a few years, and within 10 to 20 years the environment will have pretty much recovered. The major exception is beaches. Toxic oil remains among the sediments for many more years to come. Unlike the open ocean, waves and currents have great difficulty spreading out the pollution within the sediments of the beach, and thus making it less harmful. Humans have just as much difficulty cleaning up beaches after oil spills as nature does. Our best cleaning tools, things like scalding hot water from high-pressure hoses and harsh chemical cleaners, are very effective at cleaning the sediments, but they also kill the surviving algae and animals, essentially sterilizing the beach. In some cases, beaches that were not cleaned by humans have recovered faster than beaches that were cleaned. So, it is very important to keep oil spills from reaching the shoreline. Doing so can save a vast amount of time and money on cleanup efforts and reduce the time for the environment to heal. In 1969, the death and destruction produced by the blowout of an oil platform near Santa Barbara helped inspire many of the first environmental organizations in the United States. The public reaction led to President Nixon signing the bill that founded the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA. For more information, see the link in the websites section of the course website. Slide 9. To keep oil from reaching land, we use booms and skimmers. Booms are long, thin, floating barriers. Since oil floats, booms can block oil. However, waves can push oil over booms, and harsh winds and waves can sink them. We also skim oil off the surface. Typically, oil is collected using booms and then rotating plastic drums or discs are inserted into the oil. The oil sticks to the specially designed or treated plastic and is brought on board, scraped off, and the drums or discs are reinserted to skim more oil. If weather conditions are right, the oil is simply lit on fire to burn it away. Dispersants can be added to the water to break up the oil, much as you use soap to get oils and grease off your dishes. This allows the oil to spread out into smaller toxic pieces that will do less damage to ocean life, and also allows the oil to sink deeper, away from the surface where most ocean life lives. However, these dispersants are also toxic to ocean life, and for this reason they are not introduced down deep where there are few waves and currents to spread them out, because they are more likely to stay concentrated and make the bottom sediments toxic. Controversially, the company British Petroleum, BP, added dispersants deep in the ocean to try to reduce the damage being caused by oil rising up from the ocean floor from the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, 2010. The company argued that adding dispersants would keep concentrated oil from reaching the surface, and thus reduce damage to the life at the surface of the ocean. Their critics pointed out that it would also mean less oil at the surface for cameras to record, and that the oil and dispersants would remain down deep and cause damage for a much longer period of time than if they reached the surface. Of course, the damage would happen down deep where few could see or record it. A fast response to an oil spill will greatly reduce its harmfulness and make it much cheaper to clean up. The lightest parts of oil evaporate away within a few days at most, leaving behind mousse, a thick mixture of oil, air, water, and anything in the ocean water. Skimming, burning, and dispersants are much less effective on mousse. This is why oil companies are supposed to have emergency plans and clean-up equipment nearby before they start drilling. Slide 10. Bioremediation. One interesting method of cleaning up oil spills and other forms of pollution is bioremediation. Bioremediation is using living organisms to clean up pollution. For example, genetically engineered plants are being developed to soak up mercury from soil and lakes, keeping it from getting washed into the ocean. The plants can then be harvested and properly disposed of. In the case of oil, chemosynthetic bacteria that live off of oil can be introduced in the area of the oil spill. In principle, they will multiply quickly, decompose, break down the oil, and then die off or go dormant when their task is done. Research on beaches in Scotland have shown that beaches recover from a second oil spill faster than the first, presumably because of dormant bacteria that originally came to the beach after the first spill. When sand from a beach that had recovered from an oil spill was transplanted to a beach which had never endured an oil spill, researchers showed that it helped vaccinate the pristine beach against a future oil spill. Scotland is near the North Sea where there are lots of oil rigs, and more than one beach has been hit by a small leak or spill or two. As we have discussed before, if humans add or allow too many nutrients to enter the ocean, the nutrients can cause harmful algal blooms like red tides and dead zones. Wetland plants and algae are excellent at absorbing nutrients from rainwater runoff, reducing how many nutrients reach the rest of the ocean. Also, filter feeders, plankton eaters, like oysters, mussels, clams, and other shellfish can eat very small plankton, including phytoplankton, preventing their numbers from becoming large enough to cause harmful algal blooms. Thus, 2 ways to prevent harmful red tides and dead zones are to restore wetlands along the coast and to create reefs of filter feeders like oysters in estuaries. In fact, shellfish filter feeders like oysters, mussels, and clams are so good at filtering small particles out of the water that they also consume bacteria and viruses, so they clean the water of bacteria that can make swimmers sick and thus lead to government officials closing beaches, that is, putting up no swimming signs. And I should note one more example of bioremediation, one that takes place 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, in our cities and towns. Recall that we have learned that the primary role of bacteria in the ocean is to break down dead bodies and wastes, and release the atoms and molecules in the dead bodies and wastes back into the ocean waters so that they can be used again. I emphasized how bacteria release the carbon and nutrients in the dead bodies and wastes into ocean waters so that the next generation of phytoplankton can grow and begin the food chain. Nearly all animals in the ocean rely upon phytoplankton for their food, because the phytoplankton use nutrients to make molecules that allow them to capture and store energy from the sun and store it in food molecules. These food molecules or molecules containing energy derived from them are passed from one animal to the next when an animal is eaten, and we get them too when we eat seafood. In short, bacteria are the ocean's recyclers. On land, bacteria carry out the same role. And we use bacteria to recycle our wastes. In the next section we will discuss sewage, a large portion of which contains wastes like our urine and fecal matter. In sewage treatment plants, bacteria are used to break down much of the waste. In a sewage treatment plant, we provide the bacteria with an environment they like which speeds of the rate at which they break down our wastes. Slide 11. Sewage and sewage treatment. In the movie Finding Nemo, the characters repeat the line "all drains lead to the ocean" again and again. They are right, but there are 2 different systems which carry our water to the ocean, the sewer system and the storm drain system. The sewer system includes the pipes that are connected to the drains in your home, the kitchen sink, the bathroom sink, the toilet, the bathtub, the shower, the washing machine, and so on. The used water from these drains goes to a sewage treatment plant where materials are separated out according to their density, broken down using chemicals and bacteria, and sterilized, using chlorine, for example, to kill any remaining bacteria which might cause illness if we were to touch or drink the water. The other major concern is nutrients. Wastewater is rich in nutrients from the fecal matter, urine, and food that goes down the drains of our buildings. Nutrients are removed from the wastewater, so that they cannot cause a bloom of harmful algae like a red tide or dead zone when the treated wastewater is released into the environment. The solid materials left over from wastewater treatment are rich in nutrients and often sold as compost. Some treated water is used by golf courses, parks, and others. The rest of the treated water and disinfected material is released into the ocean, typically miles from shore via long, underwater sewer pipes. Sewage treatment does not remove all chemicals from wastewater. For example, sucralose, the artificial sweetener in Splenda, goes through your body without being altered and is excreted. It then goes through wastewater treatment plants and is not affected by the treatment process. When it rains, extra water goes down drains that are connected to the sewage system, and if the rainfall is heavy, water can start to back up in the sewage treatment plant. Sometimes the plant has to release untreated water into the ocean to avoid getting flooded. From a sanitation district mailer sent to me. The sanitation districts clean your wastewater, sewage, and turn it into resources 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. This is a complex process that ensures that pollutants are safely removed to protect public health and the environment. You are receiving this notice to inform you of a proposed rate increase and the public hearing scheduled for its consideration. We serve over 5.6 million people in 78 cities and unincorporated areas throughout Los Angeles County, treating 424 million gallons of wastewater per day in a way that is both environmentally sound and cost-effective. That is enough water to fill the Rose Bowl 5 times every single day. Your city owns the local sewers that collect the sewage generated in your homes and businesses. From there, we transport your sewage to one of our 11 wastewater treatment plants, through conveyance systems of 1,400 miles of large diameter sewers and 48 pumping plants. The sewage is then highly treated, producing recycled water that is suitable for a wide range of uses. Although our recycled water essentially meets drinking water standards, we don't directly drink it. Instead, we use it to replenish our groundwater supplies. It's also used to irrigate parks, golf courses, schools, and other greenbelt areas, reducing the demand on our potable water supply, drinking water supply. By recycling water, we also lessen the need for importable water, water imported from other places. Most people do not like the idea of using treated water in their gardens or homes, but I am told that it is actually quite safe. If you think about it, the water we use is always treated. People living farther inland draw water from rivers and aqueducts for their needs, treat it, and dump it back into the rivers and aqueducts that then bring the water to us. We then treat, clean, the water before we use it in our homes for drinking, cooking, cleaning, and so on. Even if you are drinking bottled water, you are drinking water which has been drawn from rivers and aqueducts and treated by a private company, instead of a public utility. Slide 12. Storm drains. You can see storm drains everywhere along the sides of our streets. Since rainwater cannot soak into the ground anymore, because we have paved over so much of the land of our cities, the job of storm drains is to get rainwater off our streets as quickly as possible so that more and more water does not build up on the surface. Such water makes driving dangerous and can flood our homes and businesses. The rainwater also picks up animal feces, from both pets and wild animals, and other materials, yard wastes like dead leaves and grass, oil drippings from cars, arsenic left behind by car tires, various heavy metals, fertilizers, and pesticides from landscaped areas, and so on. All these materials are washed directly into rivers, lakes, and the ocean. In the past, these materials were typically filtered out of the runoff by forests and wetlands. Bacteria on the fecal material can cause beachgoers to get sick. They can cause liver, breathing, and stomach problems, ear and eye infections, hepatitis, paralysis, and more. The ocean helps the bacteria get into our bodies through our eyes, ears, mouth, and so on. The water offers support to the bacteria so that they can drift to us. Note that it is bacteria from land animals that typically make human swimmers sick. Most ocean bacteria are not well adapted to invade the bodies of land mammals like humans. 85% of beach closures occur because of unacceptably high levels of fecal bacteria in the water. According to the EPA, if a beach has the maximum acceptable amount of bacteria, for the beach to stay open, about 2% of swimmers, 1 in 50, will get sick. Dangerous levels of bacteria can exist in beach water for quite some time before a beach is closed to the public. The water on beaches is not sampled every day, and local officials must wait a day or two for the results of water tests. During this time, beachgoers may be exposed to harmful bacteria and substances. Moreover, the surf zone is extremely turbulent, so by the time the test results are in and a no swimming sign has been put in places, waves and currents may have moved significant amounts of pollutants to other beaches. Note that rainwater runoff soaking into the ground is not necessarily a good thing anymore, because the water can pick up chemicals from the land that can poison our water supply. In addition, groundwater in aquifers can move from the land into the ocean, so it is another route by which chemicals can enter the ocean. Slide 13. Coastal development. Most people in the world live near the ocean, both here in the United States and elsewhere around the world. 40% or more live within 60 miles of the coast, and the total rises to well above 50% within 120 miles of the coast. Coastal populations continue to increase fast. Since more people generate more waste than fewer people, we can expect more pollution entering the ocean than in the past, unless we take action to prevent it from doing so. As we pave over more land, less water soaks into the ground, and more rainwater flows over the land and carries pollutants on the land into rivers, lakes, and the ocean. Thus, we can probably expect more ocean and worse pollution problems in the future. This is true throughout the world. Slide 14. The Clean Water Act. In the past, sewage did not have to be treated so extensively, so many coastal waters and estuaries near cities and industrial plants were heavily polluted. Since the Clean Water Act of 1972, sewage treatment plants have been required to improve the quality of the water that they release to a much higher standard, and sewage sludge, nearly untreated solid materials rich in chemicals, is no longer being dumped along the coasts of the United States. In developing countries, some cities discharge untreated sewage directly into rivers and the ocean. Thus, wastewater from sewage treatment plants is no longer a significant source of bacteria that can make us sick or nutrients that can cause a harmful bloom of algae in places like the United States. Of course, accidental spills of partially treated or untreated sewage do happen, and can potentially cause harmful blooms of algae when they do. Unlike sewage, farming still adds a large amount of nutrients to the ocean. Farmers put lots of artificial fertilizers on their crops, helping them grow more food per acre, and thus reduce the price of our food. However, large amounts of these nutrients are washed off the fields and into rivers which carry them to the ocean. In addition, big business agriculture involving industrial production of livestock, like cattle, pigs, chickens, generates vast amounts of manure, which often gets washed into rivers when it rains. Rivers carry the waste towards the ocean. Storm drain water does contain some nutrients from the land. The nutrients are not nearly as concentrated as they are in sewage and fertilizer runoff from farms. In addition to the soil on land, yard waste, and animal feces and storm drain runoff are sources of nutrients. However, it takes a while for them to be decomposed by bacteria in the ocean. The nutrients are released slowly, a little bit at a time. Thus, storm drain runoff from a city typically does not have enough nutrients in it to cause a harmful bloom of phytoplankton. Cities can become a significant source of nutrients if they use a lot of fertilizer on green spaces like parks, and inhabitants add a lot of fertilizers to their yards and gardens. Slide 15. Harmful blooms of phytoplankton. You might expect that causing blooms is a good thing. More nutrients means more phytoplankton and thus ultimately more animals for us to eat. However, unnaturally large numbers of phytoplankton can cause big problems. We will examine two major examples: dead zones, regions of water with low levels of oxygen, and toxic algal blooms, phytoplankton who make poisonous substances. Our example of a toxic algal bloom is red tides. Red tides, an example of a harmful bloom. Red tides are a bloom of red-colored phytoplankton, typically dinoflagellates. There are so many phytoplankton in the water that they make the water look red, or brown or yellowish. Some red tide algae, but not all, produce chemicals like domoic acid that are toxic to vertebrates like birds, mammals, and humans. Filter feeders like clams and other shellfish strain the algae out of the water during a bloom. They eat lots of algae, and the more they eat, the more toxic they become. This is called bioaccumulation. If we or other vertebrates, like seals and seagulls, eat the shellfish, we can become sick. Illnesses caused by toxins being passed up the food chain in this way include Ciguatera fish poisoning, CFP, diuretic shellfish poisoning, DSP, and paralytic shellfish poisoning, PSP. Slide 16. In general, it is safe to swim in red tides. You won't swallow nearly enough water to become poisoned. However, the algae do leak toxins into the water, and these cause some people to develop rashes. As long as you get out of the water when you notice the rash and wash it off, you should be fine. Breaking waves can catapult the toxins into the air, and some of these toxins cause respiratory, breathing, problems for people who live near the coast. This discussion is not true for all blooms of algae, especially those in lakes. It can be extremely dangerous to drink or even touch water in a lake filled with toxic algae. Note that the phytoplankton are not poisonous because of toxic chemicals absorbed from the water. Like many land plants, the red tide phytoplankton naturally produce chemicals that are harmful to humans. The most dangerous animals to eat after a bloom of red tide phytoplankton are filter feeders like clams, mussels, oysters and so on. When people see a bunch of dead fish floating in the water, they are usually smart enough to guess that something might be wrong with the fish. They do not say to themselves, "Yum, a free lunch." However, the toxins in red tide phytoplankton do not kill clams, mussels, oysters, and other invertebrates. Toxins build up more and more in the bodies of shellfish like clams, mussels, and oysters as they eat phytoplankton. The more phytoplankton they eat, the more toxins are entering their bodies. It should be safe to eat clams, mussels, oysters, and other shellfish in restaurants, because the United States has good regulations and does a good job of inspecting seafood. Restaurants will import shellfish if the local ones may be poisonous. Slide 17. Dead zones. An example of a harmful bloom. Another example of a harmful algal bloom is a dead zone. Dead zones occur at the end of a bloom. A bloom typically ends when there are few nutrients left in the water or it becomes too hard to get sunlight. During a bloom, phytoplankton reproduce more and more, and each offspring absorbs nutrients from the water. Each newly born phytoplankton needs enough nutrients to make chlorophyll and other molecules, so that they can carry out photosynthesis and make food for themselves. At some point, there will be few nutrients left in the water, and when phytoplankton reproduce, their offspring will not be able to find enough nutrients in the water. In other words, phytoplankton that are born will die, because they cannot get enough nutrients so that they can make food for themselves. In addition, a bloom makes the murky. All the other phytoplankton in the water block sunlight from reaching the water below them. Thus, it becomes harder and harder to get enough sunlight and make enough food to survive. Eventually the water is filled with a lot of dead phytoplankton. Phytoplankton die of old age, they only live for days, perhaps a week, or from being unable to get enough nutrients and sunlight. The algae lose their green color as their bodies break down, making the water look brown instead of green. Slide 18. All the dead phytoplankton bodies in the water encourage the growth of bacteria who get the energy they need to live by decomposing, breaking down, the dead bodies and wastes of ocean life. However, bacteria use oxygen in the water to decompose the dead bodies, just as we use oxygen to break down food molecules in our bodies. Animals who live in the areas of the bloom, because they cannot breathe. Of course, some animals can swim away. However, many animals like clams and crabs cannot swim away. Some animals who can swim do not leave, presumably because their instincts tell them that they cannot survive in the open ocean away from the coast. They will not find enough food or will get eaten. Which would you choose, to be eaten or to suffocate? Slide 19. One of the best known examples of a dead zone is the one that occurs at the end of the Mississippi River. The Mississippi drains practically the entire middle of the United States, including a vast amount of farmland. Some of the fertilizers that the farmers put on their land to help them grow more food per acre and animal wastes from huge factory farms are washed off the land and into local rivers. These rivers flow into the Mississippi River, which carries nutrient-rich water into the ocean. The resulting dead zone harms the livelihoods of the local fishers and the tourism industry. People stay away from beaches with yucky-looking and smelly water, so they do not patronize coastal businesses like hotels and restaurants and go somewhere else instead. Fish, shrimp, clams, oysters, and other seafood die from a lack of oxygen, reducing the food supply. Fishers need to go farther out in the ocean in search of animals to catch, costing them time and money for fuel. A harmful algal bloom can easily cost local communities tens of millions of dollars in lost fisheries and tourism revenues, and many such blooms happen each year in the United States. Dead zones were common in the port of Los Angeles in the 1950s. The Clean Water Act limited the amount of pollution that could be dumped in the harbor, and since the mid-1980s there have not been any more dead zones. Scientists use the word eutrophication to describe the dead zone phenomenon. Water with low levels of oxygen in it is called hypoxic. The word anoxic, no oxygen, is used to describe a lack of oxygen in the water, levels that are so low that animals cannot breathe and will die. Slide 20. More about dead zones. Low oxygen conditions are usually worst on the bottom of the ocean. Dead, decaying material sinks to the bottom, and the bacteria remove oxygen from the water as they decompose the dead bodies on the seafloor. In addition, in shallow coastal waters, the abundant phytoplankton near the surface blocks sunlight from reaching the bottom where macroalgae, seaweeds, live. The macroalgae die. Instead of adding oxygen to the water near the bottom, their decomposing bodies help use up the remaining oxygen. If the density difference between the bottom water and surface is too high, waves and tidal currents will have difficulty bringing oxygen-rich surface water down to the bottom. Therefore, global warming may be making dead zones worse. By warming the surface water, it makes it even harder for the warmer, oxygen-rich surface water from mixing with cooler, deeper water. In addition, warm water cannot hold as much oxygen as cold water, so more oxygen is given to the atmosphere and less mixes downwards. This may be one of the reasons that dead zones are becoming larger and more common, and that oxygen levels below the surface are dropping in places like the middle of the Pacific Ocean. You might expect zooplankton to eat the phytoplankton in a phytoplankton bloom, and prevent a dead zone from occurring. Zooplankton cannot eat all the new phytoplankton in a bloom, there are simply too many. Phytoplankton and bacteria can reproduce much faster than zooplankton, so while the zooplankton population grows too, zooplankton cannot keep the phytoplankton from becoming dangerously overpopulated. One major example of the restoration of a dead zone demonstrates that it is best not to let the dead zone become large and widespread in the first place. After the collapse of communism, around 1989, many Eastern European economies collapsed as well, so fewer nutrients entered the Black Sea, and its dead zone became smaller. The recovery of the ocean bottom has been very slow. The populations of animals like fish that once lived in the Black Sea did not simply bounce back when conditions became better. When the fish died due to the dead zone, jellies moved and take their place in the ecosystem, because jellies are better at tolerating low levels of oxygen. The large population of jellies now in the Black Sea eats plankton, the fish's food, and the fish's eggs and larvae, keeping the fish populations from growing quickly or at all. Scientists call this a regime shift from a population of organisms that we like to eat to a population of organisms that we do not like to eat. Unfortunately, the new, jelly-dominated regime is quite stable. Things are not going to change back to the way they were without a major disturbance. The future ocean may be a better place for jellies and worse place for fish. Warm water tends to have less oxygen than cold water. Warm, fast-moving, water molecules form weaker bonds, so warm water cannot hold onto as many oxygen molecules as cold water can. Also, as the ocean absorbs our carbon dioxide pollution from burning fossil fuels, like oil and coal, it is becoming more acidic. Many species of jellies can tolerate low oxygen water and acidic water, so they may grow more abundant in the ocean in the future and displace fish or other organisms in the food chain. Some biologists call these jellies dead-end species, because many fish and other predators that we like to eat cannot live by eating the jellies. The fish population may be unable to bounce back even if we stop overfishing and polluting the ocean, because the jellies eat their fish eggs and larvae, keeping their populations down. Harmful blooms of algae like dead zones and red tides can occur naturally. Brief strong winds are becoming more common along the coast of Oregon. They produce brief, strong upwelling events followed by brief, massive blooms of phytoplankton. Since zooplankton cannot eat them all, many dead bodies sink deep into the ocean. Bacteria bloom as they decompose the bodies and in doing so use up all the oxygen in the deep waters, killing many of the animals who live there. Even unnaturally large blooms of phytoplankton that do not result in dead zones can cause problems. Many ocean animals begin life as zooplankton that feed on phytoplankton. When they grow up, they become nekton or benthos that eat other things like seaweed, zooplankton, or corals. If there is an unnaturally large bloom of phytoplankton, fewer animals will die from a lack of food as kids. So more of these animals will survive and become adults that feed on something different. Since there are more adults than normal, the animals eat more food than normal. These adults can disrupt their ecosystems by eating too much. For example, they might eat up all the kelp in a kelp forest or all the corals in a coral reef. This eventually harms them too, because they will run out of food and starve. Slide 21. Invasive species. Invasive species are non-native species. They are animals, algae, bacteria, and so on that have been introduced to a new place. Invasive species are also known as alien or exotic species. Perhaps invasive species are not really an example of pollution, but they are an example of how human actions and negligence can harm an ocean environment, much like pollution. If you think about it, there are three things that can happen when a foreign species is introduced into a new environment. The non-native species will die out, its members may be quickly eaten, become an exotic snack for the locals, or unable to find food, nothing looks appetizing to it, or it cannot catch anything. Members of the species might be unable to find anyone to reproduce with or have anyone to reproduce with. Perhaps only males traveled to the new place. The non-native species will be able to survive and become a new member of the environment. The non-native species will be better than the native species in some way. Perhaps its members are better at finding food or local predators do not, or cannot, eat it. Almost all introduced species will die out, but a few will fall into the last category. Its advantages will allow it to take over the environment where it was introduced, and the native species begin to die out. Invasive species can arrive in a new place on their own, but nowadays humans are carrying more and more with them as we quickly and easily travel the globe. Sometimes we even introduce new species intentionally, thinking that we will make a place better. So many foreign species have been introduced to San Francisco Bay, intentionally and unintentionally, that it almost entirely contains foreign species. We don't even know what it was originally like. There are many examples of aquatic invasive species, but I will only discuss three: toxic algae, zebra mussels, and Caulerpa taxifolia. Toxic dinoflagellates, a kind of phytoplankton, some of which cause red tides, are spreading around the world. They have been transported from estuary to estuary, and have poisoned the food chain in their new homes via bioaccumulation. Slide 22. Probably the most famous example of an aquatic invasive species is zebra mussels, a kind of mollusk, a clam-like animal, that grows on hard surfaces like rocks. The zebra mussel was introduced to the Great Lakes from Europe in the 1980s, and spread quickly since it has no natural predators. It has killed native species by growing over them, taking the space where they want to live, or eating lots of plankton, causing native species to run out of food and starve. In addition, zebra mussels grow everywhere, clogging all kinds of pipes, like storm drains, sewer pipes, and power plant inflow and outflow pipes. The United States spends over $100 million per year scraping them off pipes, so that water can freely flow down the pipe, and other surfaces, a breathtaking amount of money. In Southern California we have our own invader, Caulerpa taxifolia, a fast-growing tropical seaweed that has caused havoc in the Mediterranean Sea already. Caulerpa taxifolia pushes aside native algae, and local animals do not eat it. When animals eat the native algae, a lot of Caulerpa taxifolia grows where the native algae once was, so it just spreads and spreads. Note that this means there is less food for native animals. Caulerpa taxifolia is a popular decoration in aquariums, and it is thought that it was introduced along our coast when someone dumped their aquarium in the ocean. Caulerpa taxifolia was found in San Diego and Orange County in 2000, but fortunately, our expensive efforts to get it under control appear to have succeeded, thus preserving the food supply for native species. Marine invasive species are most commonly carried from place to place in the ballast water of cargo ships. Ballast water is water that is pumped into a ship from the ocean when a ship is not fully loaded. The water weighs the ship down so that it does not tilt when one end or side of the ship is unloaded, it does not rock back and forth too much, it is at the right height to be unloaded by cranes on land, and its propeller and rudder are at the right depth for maneuvering. The problem is that the ballast water may contain lots of plankton, and if the plankton survive the trip, they may be pumped out into a foreign estuary and take over. Remember that many ocean animals begin life as zooplankton, so animals that live on surfaces and the ocean floor, like mussels, and animals that swim, like fish, can be transported in ballast water when they are young. Scientists have worked on a number of systems to kill animals in ballast water. These typically involve using chemicals to kill the plankton in the ballast water. The main concern with this solution is that the poison will get released out into estuaries with the ballast water, and poison native animals in our food supply. A simple solution is to require ships to dump their ballast water in the middle of the ocean and take on new ballast water out there as well. Open ocean species can get into an estuary on their own, and presumably already would have done so if they could survive in the estuaries. So, dumping ballast water containing open ocean species into an estuary is unlikely to cause any harm. Unfortunately, this costs time and money, so most ship owners are unwilling to do it. It takes a lot of fuel to get the huge cargo ship going and to bring it to a stop. Local communities like our own have no right to make the ship owners do so, because only the federal government can make rules about interstate and international commerce. In 2004, the George W. Bush administration finally abandoned its use of voluntary guidelines, only about 30% of ships were complying, and instituted mandatory regulations with fines ranging up to $27,000.